Good morning, everyone. I'm Yvonne Miller. I'm Professor of Design Psychology and Director of the QC Design Lab at Queensland University of Technology. And I'm delighted to be with you this morning to talk through the relationship older people have with climate change and how we might rethink about that and redesign that. And at the outset, let me pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands where we meet today, or where I am at least, the Turrbal and Yagara people in Brisbane, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. And I think it's important when we think about climate change and our planet and the impact our actions have on where we live and our earth, that we do think about how perhaps one of our oldest civilizations and our Indigenous elders, their relationship with land is a really great place to start. So we are right now living through the Anthropocene, that is the age of humans. And there's overwhelming evidence that the Earth is, our most recent geological time period anyway, is changing because of human influenced actions. Simply put, people are changing the planet. And when we think about the people that are changing the planet and the voices that we hear in the climate change dialogue, we hear a lot from our youngest generations, in particular, of course, Greta Thunberg, who was the Time Person of the Year in 2019. And one of the things I wonder about is if she's going to be positioned as a hero, who might be positioned as the villain in this debate? And could it be the older person? It could be argued, and I'll talk about some data and some research I've done in this space in a little bit. It could be argued that older people may well be positioned as being responsible for climate change, or at least not stopping or acting. We have, of course, some wonderful leadership of older people, and of course, Sir David Attenborough is one. He spoke at the recent United Nations Climate Change Action Summit, arguing that he's seen the natural world at its most fascinating and vibrant, but he's witnessed some startling changes, and these changes are threatening various civilizations, and what we do now is going to determine the next few thousand years. And we see across the globe that global warming is one of the many factors that is influencing decisions that people make in terms of their voting actions. So you can see here that about half, or nearly half, of all people in the US have identified climate change or global warming as a factor influencing who they're going to vote for. But the rank or the relative importance is most important in the millennials in comparison to, say, the baby boomers or the silent generation. And so in thinking about these differences, we have to start thinking about how we're communicating about climate change and who's listening and who's speaking and whose voices are being privileged. I did some research with colleagues several years ago now where we talked with a variety of stakeholders, both young and old, in rural Australia. And their feedback was that we need to think about our terminology. And so for some, particularly older rural residents, they preferred the phrase weather variability. And their argument was, that the weather's always changed, and they would prefer to use that terminology rather than the phrase climate change. And there was a lot of talk about how this changes are cyclic, and let me read, we're a blip on the map in evolution. Climate change has been occurring before we humans ever got here. I mean, it wiped out the dinosaurs, didn't it? So there's a whole lot of, people who are not listening and are turned off by the terminology, and we need to think about that. And the Guardian newspaper actually just recently updated its style guide to encourage its reporters to move away from using the phrase climate change to use preferred terms such as climate emergency, climate crisis, or climate breakdown. And the reason they've done this is because they want to convey a sense of urgency. So there's a few things I want to talk about today briefly, and the first is focused on the structure that we've been given. Are older people, could they be perceived as being the villains in the climate change debate? And I've in the past written about how older people actually could be seen as being contributors to climate change and actually often describe themselves as contributors. So there was a project we did on the Sunshine Coast talking to rural residents there about evaluating a environmental sustainability program. And so the people who participated were quite sustainable, and they talked about and then we read, we'll be here in 20 years. It's what we leave for you. We don't really want it to be a nightmare. We don't want to be labelled the nightmare generation that left you the mess. Although I don't feel personally responsible, that's how it's sort of coming up and could be labelled, that we're the baby boomers that have done good and bad things. And so there is a sense amongst some older people at least that potentially baby boomers could be labelled the villains in this climate crisis. The second and perhaps most dominant dialogue is that older people are the victims or the casualties of climate change. I mean, we know when disaster strikes, older people are often uniquely vulnerable and disproportionately negatively impacted. In Hurricane Katrina, 71% of the people killed were aged 60 years and over, even though older people were only 15% of the population. And even though there are elements of poverty and race and social class in that, when we look at other disasters, we see that very often older people are among the most vulnerable. Two of my PhD students have done research looking at older people's experience of significant weather events, the Brisbane floods and the tropical cyclones in far north Queensland, and I'll talk about their findings briefly now. So Sandy Astow looked at older people in far north Queensland and their experience with the cyclone, and you can see here from these quotes that age and being older makes coping harder. One older man talked about the stress and the fear on his wife's face and how it was too much and that they just felt alone and isolated and relying on the kindness of strangers to survive, and it was just overpowering. Another woman described how she knew she'd be okay while her husband was alive, but she didn't know how she would cope if something happened to him. And then another man explained how as he's got older his stamina has decreased and he found that lugging the sandbags just really took it out of him, and so there was a real challenge to prepare for a cyclone. And social workers and emergency workers noticed the same. So they talked about the physical side, the challenges of older people being up ladders and fixing roofs, and being vulnerable, being disabled and ill, and having sight and hearing problems, and sometimes not having a car, which made evacuating and just choices about responding much more challenging. My student Lauren Blocky in this worked with older people who'd been experienced the Brisbane floods, and in a method called research poetry, we turned the interview transcripts into poems or poem-like prose. Let me read this to you. I'm 74. I was born 1939. I'm not as strong as I used to be. I can't lift things. When it starts to rain, when they predict a storm, say strong winds, flash flooding, it's hair-raising. You think, is it on again? You think, what am I going to do? You think, what if it's just the missus and I here? You think, oh, what am I going to do? Got to sink or swim. And the second poem captures the sense of isolation some older community dwelling residents felt during the flood. I'm on my own, been here 9 years. I don't see anyone. I couldn't tell you the name of anyone. Wouldn't know them if fell over them. I'm on my own here. There were a lot of people, police and emergency crews going around, but they never stopped. I just did what I could by myself. Can't lift furniture, you know, impossible. I did what I could. I loaded my car until I couldn't get any more in. I said goodbye to the rest of it. Nobody came to help me. I did get a text message to say get out. I did get that. And I think you get a real sense of the challenge of navigating a significant weather event when you're by yourself and old. And the third proposition, and the one that probably most excites me, is this notion that older people could be vanquishers or change agents in climate change. And when we think about how we might spend our retirement, we might talk about spending time with kids and grandkids or just resting and relaxing. But some of my participants in a research study I did spoke about how their hobby was global warming and peak oil. And we could, if we wanted, argue and support and reposition sustainability as a leisure activity or something people could do as a way to give back to the community. And so these older Australians I talked to lived their lives as sustainability role models, and they were really proud of that. And they were challenging themselves to deepen a commitment to sustainability, and they were learning about enhancing and always doing different things, whether it was a no shopping challenge or a zero waste lifestyle, learning to build a worm farm. They were really pushing themselves. And a lot talked about how they were choosing to live frugally, as they had in the past and as their parents and grandparents had, and that's something we, this next generation, must learn to do the same. But critically, being a sustainability role model wasn't easy. It involved sacrifices and choices and struggles and disappointment. One woman, for example, was building a house and she really wanted to build a swimming pool, but she knew that it wasn't the right choice in terms of the environment. And they also were concerned about not being perceived to go too far outside the norm and not to be a tree-hugging loony. So it was a real balance. But in this article, I argue that many of these older people talked about being sustainable and living a sustainable lifestyle as a leisure activity or as serious leisure, hobbies, if we would, go to yoga or play hockey or something. And so maybe what we need to do is change the conversation and talk a little bit about sustainability as a hobby for older people and for all of us, really. And finally, we need to use much more innovative models to engage people in a conversation that goes across dialogues and across sectors and industries. So this is a wonderful project from the Arts House in Melbourne, and over 5 years they've engaged artists and emergency workers and communities, older people, Indigenous elders and youth in acting out what might happen during an emergency to prepare the community for the climate crisis. So in 2016, they focused on a flood, it was a heat wave. 2018 was actually a pandemic. 2019 was what happens if a climate crisis displaces people, and 2020 is about if we have multiple climate crises, what can we do? And I really love this as an approach because it looks at how we might come together and put our heads together and collaborate, because that's when we'll really be prepared as a whole community to respond to the climate crisis.